Shadow cowered in the corner of the cold metal kennel, his once proud German Shepherd frame now trembling uncontrollably. The fluorescent lights of Pinecrest County Animal Shelter cast harsh shadows across his face as Rick, a visibly frustrated shelter worker, approached with a cleaning hose. Shadow's amber eyes, once bright with purpose and intelligence, were now wide with terror, a silent testament to traumas unseen and untold. When Rick's hand suddenly rose above him, Shadow didn't growl or snap as many abused dogs might. Instead, he pressed himself harder against the wall, making himself impossibly small, as if trying to disappear from existence altogether. What happened in the next 30 seconds would not only alter the course of Shadow's life, but would expose a web of corruption that had been festering beneath the surface of Pinecrest County for years, a darkness that had swallowed many animals before him, leaving no trace of their silent suffering. How could a decorated police canine, once the pride of the Pinecrest Police Department, end up cowering in a shelter kennel under a false identity? What forces were powerful enough to orchestrate the disappearance of a highly trained law enforcement partner? And what secrets was Shadow carrying that made him both valuable and dangerous to the wrong people? If you've ever wondered about the hidden stories behind the animals we see in shelters, or the silent battles fought by those who can't speak for themselves, subscribe to K9 Code Red. This is more than just a story about a dog. It's a journey through darkness and light that reveals how the most profound healing often comes from our deepest wounds. Chapter 1. The vanishing officer Michael Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It had been exactly 4 hours since Shadow, his German Shepherd partner of 3 years, had disappeared during what should have been a routine training exercise in the wooded area behind the Pinecrest Police Department's K9 facility. The autumn air carried a crisp chill as dusk approached, painting the search scene in fading orange light that grew dimmer with each passing minute. He wouldn't just run off, Michael insisted for what felt like the 100th time, his voice strained as he addressed Lieutenant Wilson. Shadow's training is impeccable, something happened to him. Lieutenant Wilson's expression remained professionally neutral, but Michael could see the skepticism in his eyes. We've had the entire K9 unit and half the patrol division searching for 4 hours, Reeves. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing on his GPS tracker. Sometimes even the best trained dogs follow a scent and get disoriented. Michael shook his head, running a hand through his dark hair, now damp with sweat despite the cool evening. Not Shadow. He's never failed to respond to recall, not once in 3 years. He didn't add what he was really thinking, that Shadow wasn't just his partner, he was family. After Michael's divorce 2 years ago, it had been just the two of them in the small ranch house on the edge of town. Shadow had been the constant that kept him anchored through the darkest nights. As darkness fell completely, the search coordinator called for the team to regroup. Flashlights cut through the gloom as officers emerged from different sections of the woods, each bearing the same silent message in their empty hands and solitary returns: no sign of Shadow. "We'll resume at first light," Lieutenant Wilson said, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Go home, get some rest. Shadow's microchipped, he's wearing his tactical vest with GPS. If someone finds him, we'll know immediately." But Michael knew he wouldn't sleep. As he walked slowly to his truck, he replayed the afternoon in his mind. Shadow had been performing flawlessly during the narcotics detection exercise. They'd been working a new training scenario involving multiple hidden packages in an abandoned ranger station. Shadow had already located 3 of the 5 training samples when Michael had stepped outside briefly to answer a call from dispatch. When he'd returned less than 2 minutes later, Shadow was gone. No barking, no signs of disturbance. Nothing but silence where there should have been the familiar sound of Shadow's methodical sniffing and the click of his nails on the wooden floor. At home, Michael moved through the quiet house like a ghost. Shadow's bed in the corner of the living room, his food and water bowls in the kitchen, his favorite rope toy still lying where he dropped it that morning, all painfully empty reminders of his absence. Michael pulled out his phone and stared at the most recent photo of Shadow, taken just last week during a demonstration at the local elementary school. The German Shepherd stood at perfect attention beside him, ears erect, eyes focused and intelligent, the embodiment of canine nobility and purpose. "Where are you, buddy?" Michael whispered to the empty room. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by dreams of Shadow running through endless woods, always just beyond Michael's reach. By dawn, he was already dressed and heading back to the search area, determined to find some trace of his partner. Days turned into weeks. The official search was scaled back after the first 72 hours, then officially suspended after 2 weeks. Michael used every vacation day and personal day he had, continuing to search on his own time, putting up flyers, checking shelters, and following up on reported sightings that never panned out. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we may not find him, the department psychologist told him during a mandatory counseling session a month after Shadow's disappearance. Rural areas have coyotes, there are highways nearby. Michael cut her off. He's alive. I would know if he wasn't. The psychologist made a note on her pad. That's a common feeling among handlers. It's not just a feeling, Michael insisted. Shadow and I have been through shootouts, building searches, and a warehouse fire. We have a connection, and that connection isn't gone. Eventually, Michael was assigned a new partner, a young Belgian Malinois named Rex, and returned to active duty. He worked diligently with Rex, who was eager to please and showed great promise. But at night, Shadow's empty bed remained in the corner of the living room, and Michael still found himself scanning the roadside whenever he drove, searching for a flash of black and tan among the trees. 2 months after Shadow's disappearance, Michael received a call from Sergeant Martinez, who oversaw evidence processing. "Reeves, you should come down to the station," Martinez said, his tone carefully neutral. "We've got something on that case you've been working, the prescription drug ring operating out of the abandoned Phillips warehouse." It was a case Michael and Shadow had been involved with before Shadow's disappearance, a large-scale operation distributing counterfeit prescription medications and a new synthetic drug that had already claimed 3 lives in Pinecrest County. When Michael arrived at the evidence room, Martinez was waiting with a small evidence bag containing what looked like soil samples. "This was collected during the raid last night," Martinez explained. "The lab rushed the analysis because of the similar chemical markers to previous samples." Michael looked at the report attached to the bag, then back at Martinez, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand. Why call me specifically about soil samples?" Martinez lowered his voice. "Because the soil composition exactly matches samples we found on Shadow's training equipment. The rare mineral markers are identical, it's from the same location." He paused, letting the implication sink in. Wherever Shadow was before he disappeared, he was in the same place where these drugs are being manufactured. Michael felt his heart rate accelerate as pieces began to click into place. Shadow was a detection specialist, trained to identify narcotics, including new synthetic compounds. If he had somehow discovered a production site during their training, "This isn't a coincidence," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone took him because of what he could find." Martinez nodded grimly. "That's what I'm thinking too. And if that's the case," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "If Shadow had been taken because of his detection abilities, then there was a chance, a real chance, that he was still alive." For the first time in 2 months, Michael felt the spark of genuine hope. But with it came a chilling realization: finding Shadow meant unraveling a criminal conspiracy that had already gone to extreme lengths to protect itself. Someone had orchestrated the disappearance of a police canine, a federal offense, which meant they were both sophisticated and desperate. "I need to see all the evidence from the warehouse raid," Michael said, a renewed sense of purpose straightening his posture. "Every photo, every report, every witness statement." "I thought you might say that," Martinez replied, sliding a file folder across the table. "I've already pulled everything. But Reeves," he hesitated, "this needs to be by the book. If there's really a connection, we need to build a case that will hold up. No cowboy stuff." Michael nodded, already flipping through the file. "By the book," he agreed, though they both knew that if it came to a choice between following procedure and finding Shadow, there would be no choice at all. What Michael couldn't know as he left the evidence room with the file tucked under his arm was that Shadow was closer than he imagined, and that the next 24 hours would bring them back into each other's lives in a way neither could have anticipated, through an act of cruelty that would inadvertently expose everything. Chapter 2: Behind the Kennel Door. The man called him Maverick, but the German shepherd knew it wasn't his name. Names carried scents and sounds that resonated deep in his memory, and this one lacked the familiar warmth that made his ears prick up in recognition. His real name tasted like trust and safety in his mind. It tasted like home. Shadow lay with his head on his paws, watching the movements in the shelter through wary eyes. He had been here for 3 days now, brought in as a stray allegedly found wandering near the interstate. The small white room with metal bars smelled of bleach and fear, a cocktail of scents from dozens of animals who had passed through before him. His world had become a bewildering series of confinements. First, the dark basement with concrete floors where they had kept him after taking him from the training site. He remembered the sharp sting in his neck before everything went dark that day, then waking in a place that smelled of chemicals that burned his sensitive nose. Men with unfamiliar voices had kept him muzzled and confined to a small crate, occasionally taking him out for brief, restricted walks where he was never allowed to explore or sniff freely. There had been pain too, a sharp, burning sensation in his shoulder where his microchip had been. He could still feel the tender spot when he moved a certain way. After what felt like many days in that chemical-smelling place, they had transported him in the back of a van, eventually bringing him here to this shelter with its cacophony of barking dogs and unfamiliar humans. Shadow's training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, to wait for commands, to trust that his handler would come for him. But as days stretched into weeks, that training had battled against his more primal instincts, the need to escape, to find his way back to the human whose scent meant safety and partnership. He heard footsteps approaching and tensed. It was the impatient one, the human whose movements were too quick, whose voice carried frustration and anger just beneath the surface. Shadow had learned to read humans long before his police training. It was instinct honed by thousands of years of canine evolution. This human was dangerous not because he wanted to be, but because he was carrying too much pressure inside, like a vessel about to crack. Rick appeared at the kennel door, cleaning supplies in hand. "All right, Maverick, let's get this over with," he muttered, unlocking the door. Shadow pressed himself further into the corner, making himself small. The posture was instinctive now, a submissive response he'd adopted during his confinement to avoid provoking his captors. It wasn't in his nature to cower. He had been selected for the canine program, specifically for his confident, stable temperament. But repeated rough handling and isolation had chipped away at that confidence, teaching him that stillness meant safety. "Come on, move," Rick snapped, trying to shift Shadow to one side of the kennel so he could clean the other half. Shadow froze, eyes wide, body tense. Every muscle in his body screamed to retreat further, to find some escape from the looming threat. When Rick reached for his collar, Shadow cowered deeper into the corner. What happened next was captured by the shelter's security camera mounted in the hallway, a silent witness to a moment of cruelty born of frustration. Rick, his patience exhausted after hours of cleaning kennels and managing an overcrowded shelter with too little help, raised his hand and struck Shadow across the muzzle. "I said move." The pain was sharp but brief. What lasted longer was the shock, the fundamental violation of trust between human and dog. Shadow yelped and pressed himself harder against the wall, trembling violently, eyes showing pure terror. Rick finished cleaning quickly and left, slamming the kennel door behind him without realizing he hadn't properly secured the latch. Too preoccupied with his next task, and eager to put distance between himself and what he'd just done, he failed to notice the slight gap between door and frame. Shadow remained frozen in place long after Rick left, the memory of the blow replaying in his mind. Unlike humans, dogs don't process time in linear narratives, but in sensory associations. The strike had triggered memories of other rough hands during his captivity, creating a web of fear responses that kept him immobilized. 30 minutes later, the shelter door opened, bringing a waft of fresh autumn air that carried a multitude of scents from the outside world. Among them was something that made Shadow's nostrils flare, the faint trace of the familiar chemical compounds he had been trained to detect, the same scents that had been prevalent in the place where he'd been kept after his abduction. Slowly, instinct and training began to overcome fear. Shadow rose to his feet, muscles stiff from prolonged tension. He approached the kennel door cautiously, nose working to process the complex information carried on the air. When he nudged the door with his nose, it swung open slightly. Freedom, or at least a different kind of danger, lay beyond that gap. Shadow hesitated, torn between the fear of the unknown and the certainty of remaining in the kennel where he'd been hurt. Then another scent reached him, the subtle fragrance of someone kind. It came from a young woman who had just entered the dog wing, carrying a bag that smelled of treats, and carrying the complex bouquet of scents that suggested veterinary work. Making his decision, Shadow slipped through the gap in the door. Moving with the stealth that had made him an exceptional tracking dog, he kept his body low, hugging the wall as he navigated the corridor. The building's layout was confusing, a maze of hallways and rooms filled with unfamiliar sounds and smells. He avoided the areas where human scents were strongest, instinctively seeking quieter spaces. Eventually, he found himself in a small room filled with stacked supplies, blankets, towels, cleaning materials. The chemical smells were unpleasant but less threatening than the open areas where humans might find him. Shadow squeezed behind a pile of folded blankets, making himself as small and invisible as possible, and waited. His police training had included extended periods of stillness during surveillance operations with Michael. He could remain motionless for hours when necessary, conserving energy while maintaining complete awareness of his surroundings. Now that training served him well as he listened to the sounds of the shelter, footsteps passing in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the distant barking of other dogs. Time passed. Shadow's sensitive ears picked up the first sounds of alarm as shelter staff realized he was missing from his kennel. Voices became more urgent. Footsteps quickened. Doors opened and closed more frequently as the search expanded. Maverick, here, boy. The unfamiliar name washed over him without response. He remained hidden, his breathing slow and controlled, his body still except for the slight tremor that had become a constant companion since his abduction. Then he caught it again, that scent of kindness, now closer. Soft footsteps approached the supply closet. The door opened, allowing a wedge of light to fall across the floor. Shadow held perfectly still, but his eyes, reflecting the light, gave away his position. "Oh," a soft female voice exclaimed. "There you are." The young woman crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance. Shadow could smell her clearly now, a complex bouquet of other animals, medicine, and the natural scent of a human who spent time outdoors. There was no fear or anger in her scent, only concern and something else, a calm steadiness that reminded him, just slightly, of Michael. "Hey there," she said softly, making no move to reach for him. "You've had a rough day, haven't you?" Shadow watched her cautiously. She was different from the others. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her voice gentle. She sat down on the floor, her back against the wall, creating even more distance between them. "My name's Sarah," she continued, still in that soft, even tone. "I'm just going to sit here for a bit, if that's okay with you." For the first time since his abduction, Shadow felt the rigid fear inside him loosen just slightly. This human wasn't trying to grab him or force him out of his hiding place. She was simply waiting. It was almost like the patient training sessions with Michael, where stillness and calm were rewarded. Sarah pulled out her phone, but didn't try to take pictures of him. Instead, she began to read aloud, her voice creating a gentle rhythm of words that didn't demand anything from him. The sound washed over Shadow like a soothing current, gradually easing the constant state of tension he'd been holding in his body. The old dog sighed and laid his head on his paws. Sarah read from what appeared to be a story on her phone. He had seen many seasons come and go, many storms and many fair days. Through it all, he had remained faithful. An hour passed this way, with Sarah reading and Shadow watching from his shelter behind the blankets. Occasionally, he would blink slowly or shift his position slightly, tiny signals that the acute stress response was gradually subsiding. Eventually, the door opened again, and a man's voice spoke in hushed tones. "Did you find?" He stopped abruptly upon seeing the scene. "How long have you been in here with him?" "About an hour," Sarah replied, not looking up from her phone, to avoid breaking the calm atmosphere she'd created. "He's terrified, Tom. Something happened to him." Tom, who Sarah knew as the shelter manager, crouched down to peer at Shadow. "How did he get out of his kennel?" I don't know, Sarah said, but he's not acting like a normal stray. Look at how he's holding himself. That's trauma response. Tom sighed. Let's check the security footage. Can you stay with him while I figure out a safe way to get him back to a secure space? We can't leave him in the supply closet. Of course, Sarah nodded. I think he's responding to the reading. I'll keep going. As Tom left, Sarah resumed her quiet narration, and Shadow settled his head on his paws, maintaining his vigilant watch but allowing himself the smallest measure of rest in the presence of the first kind human he'd encountered since losing Michael. What neither Shadow nor Sarah knew was that Tom's review of the security footage would reveal not only Rick's abuse, but would set in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead Shadow back to Michael and expose a criminal network that had tentacles reaching deep into Pinecrest County's government and law enforcement community. Chapter 3. Worlds Colliding. Tom Grayson had seen plenty of troubling things during his 15 years in animal welfare work, but what he witnessed on the security footage made his stomach turn. The clear image of Rick striking the German Shepherd was bad enough. The dog's reaction, pure terror rather than aggression, spoke volumes about what this animal had endured before arriving at the shelter. Son of a bitch, Tom muttered, rewinding the footage to watch it again. He expanded his review, going back through days of recordings. What he found suggested a pattern. Rick's rough handling wasn't limited to Shadow. There were multiple instances of unnecessarily forceful restraint, yanking on leashes, and impatient handling that, while perhaps not rising to the level of outright abuse in each case, painted a disturbing picture of a staff member who shouldn't be working with vulnerable animals. Tom picked up the phone and called Jenny Winters, the shelter's volunteer coordinator, who was out sick that day. Jenny, I need you to come in if you can. We have a situation with that German Shepherd brought in on Monday, and with Rick Davis. By evening they had reviewed all the footage and made some disturbing discoveries. Not only had Rick abused Shadow, but the circumstances of the dog's arrival at the shelter were suspicious. The intake form listed Shadow, recorded as Maverick, as a stray found near Highway 16, but earlier security footage showed Rick bringing the dog in through the back entrance after hours, with another man whose face wasn't clearly visible. He didn't find this dog as a stray, Tom said, staring at the grainy image of two men unloading what appeared to be a sedated German Shepherd from a private vehicle, not an animal control van. He brought him in deliberately and created a false intake story. Jenny nodded grimly. And there's something else. She pulled up the intake photos on her tablet and compared them with the dog currently huddled in the shelter's small conference room, where Sarah had managed to coax him with continued gentle reading and patience. Notice the markings around his eyes and muzzle. They're different from our standard intake photos, and there's this small scar on his right flank that isn't documented. Tom looked closer. What are you saying? I'm saying this might not be a random stray. The markings and that distinctive scar. I've seen police canines with similar identification markers. Tom felt a chill run through him. Are you suggesting this is a police dog? It's possible. And there's another issue. When we scanned for a microchip during intake, nothing showed up. But look here. Jenny pointed to a barely visible mark on the dog's shoulder visible in one of the photos. That could be a recent incision. If someone removed a microchip, the implications were serious enough that Tom immediately contacted the police department. Within an hour, Detective Laura Ramirez was reviewing their evidence. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as she examined the footage and photos. There was a K9 officer reported missing about 2 months ago, she finally said. A German Shepherd named Shadow. His handler, Officer Reeves, has been searching for him ever since. Could this be him? Tom asked. It's possible. I'll contact Reeves immediately. He'd recognize his partner instantly. Michael was in the middle of a training session with Rex when his phone rang. Seeing Detective Ramirez's number, he quickly handed Rex's lead to another officer and stepped away to take the call. Reeves, we may have found Shadow, Ramirez said without preamble. Pinecrest County Animal Shelter. They have a German Shepherd brought in as a stray 3 days ago under suspicious circumstances. Michael felt his heart lurch in his chest. Is he okay? He's alive, but he's showing signs of severe trauma. And Michael, there's evidence his microchip was surgically removed. This wasn't a random disappearance. I'm on my way. The drive to the shelter was a blur. Michael's mind raced with questions and emotions, hope that this was truly Shadow, fear about his condition, and a burning anger toward whoever had taken him. If Shadow's disappearance was connected to their drug investigation, as the soil evidence suggested, then someone had deliberately targeted his partner. When Michael arrived at the shelter, Tom met him at the entrance and quickly briefed him on the situation, the suspicious circumstances of Maverick's arrival, Rick's abuse caught on camera, and the dog's current state of extreme fear. He's in our conference room with Sarah, one of our volunteers who's been able to keep him calm, Tom explained as he led Michael through the building. I should warn you, he's not the same dog he probably was when you last saw him. Trauma changes them. Michael nodded, trying to prepare himself. I understand. When Tom opened the conference room door, Michael's first glimpse of the German Shepherd huddled in the corner sent a jolt of recognition through him. Despite the weight loss and the fearful posture so unlike the confident canine he remembered, there was no doubt in his mind. Shadow, he whispered. The reaction was immediate and stunning. Shadow's head snapped up, ears perked forward, his entire body tensing not in fear but in alertness. For a long moment, dog and handler stared at each other across the room, reconnecting through a bond that 2 months of separation hadn't broken. Then Shadow broke his stillness, rising to his feet and crossing the room in a direct line to Michael. There was no exuberant greeting. Shadow wasn't capable of that in his current state, but he pressed himself against Michael's legs, his body trembling not with fear now, but with recognition, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. Michael knelt slowly, fighting back tears as he gently placed his hands on Shadow's sides, feeling the prominent ribs beneath the once glossy coat. Hey partner, he said softly. I've been looking everywhere for you. Sarah, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, watched the reunion with tears in her eyes. He recognizes you, she said. This is the first time he's approached anyone voluntarily. Michael nodded, unable to speak as emotion closed his throat. He ran his hands gently over Shadow, noting every change in his partner's condition, the weight loss, the dull coat, the healing incision where the microchip had been removed, and most concerning, the profound change in his demeanor. The confident, sociable canine had been replaced by a dog showing classic signs of severe trauma and abuse. Detective Ramirez, who had arrived shortly after Michael, stood in the doorway with Tom and Jenny. We need to document everything, she said quietly. This is now officially part of our investigation into the counterfeit drug ring. Whoever took Shadow, they did it because of his connection to that case. The examination that followed was thorough but gentle. A veterinarian confirmed that Shadow's microchip had indeed been surgically removed, a procedure that would have required someone with at least basic veterinary knowledge. Blood tests revealed traces of sedatives consistent with long-term use, suggesting he had been kept drugged during at least part of his captivity. Most damning was the match between soil samples from Shadow's paws and the samples collected during the warehouse raid, concrete evidence linking his disappearance to the drug manufacturing operation. They took him because of what he knows, Michael said as they reviewed the findings. Shadow was trained to detect the specific chemical compounds in those counterfeit drugs. He must have picked up their scent during our training exercise near the old ranger station, and they couldn't risk him leading us to their operation. Detective Ramirez nodded, and bringing him to the shelter under a false identity was their way of hiding him in plain sight. If Rick hadn't abused him, if he hadn't escaped from his kennel and been found by Sarah. The sentence hung unfinished, but they all understood the implication. Shadow might have simply disappeared into the system, adopted out or transferred to another facility where Michael would never have found him. Or worse, once they no longer needed to keep him alive as part of their cover-up, he might have been disposed of entirely. As the initial shock of the reunion subsided, the focus shifted to Shadow's recovery and the expanding investigation. Rick had been suspended pending investigation, and police were working to identify the second man seen on the security footage helping to bring Shadow into the shelter. I want to take him home, Michael said firmly. He needs familiar surroundings, routine, security. The veterinarian nodded. That would be best for his psychological recovery. But you should be prepared. Trauma like this doesn't resolve overnight. He's going to need time, patience, and possibly professional behavioral support. I've got all the time in the world, Michael replied, his hand resting protectively on Shadow's head. Whatever he needs. That evening, Michael brought Shadow home to the house they had shared before his disappearance. The German Shepherd moved cautiously through the familiar space, his nose working constantly as he reacquainted himself with scents that had once been the backdrop of his daily life. When he reached his bed in the corner of the living room, untouched since the day he'd disappeared, Shadow paused, sniffing intently. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped onto the bed and turned in a tight circle before lying down, his eyes still watchful but containing a glimmer of recognition. He was home. Michael sat on the floor nearby, giving Shadow space while maintaining a reassuring presence. "We're going to get through this, buddy," he promised quietly. "And we're going to find the people who did this to you." What Michael didn't yet realize was that the conspiracy behind Shadow's abduction reached much higher than a handful of drug manufacturers and a compromised shelter worker. The evidence they would uncover in the coming days would shake the foundations of Pinecrest County's government and reveal corruption in places no one had thought to look, all because a security camera had captured a moment of cruelty that exposed the first thread of a much larger web. Chapter 4: The Scent of Corruption. The first night home was difficult. Shadow, startled at every unfamiliar sound, pacing anxiously between windows and doors, his training to alert to potential threats now heightened by trauma into hypervigilance. Michael slept on the couch rather than in his bedroom, wanting to remain visible to Shadow throughout the night. By morning, exhaustion had finally overcome Shadow's anxiety, and he slept curled tightly in his bed, while Michael made quiet phone calls to arrange time off work and consult with Dr. Layla Patel, a veterinary behaviorist specializing in trauma recovery for working dogs. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Patel warned during their first consultation 3 days later. She sat cross-legged on Michael's living room floor, maintaining a respectful distance from Shadow, who watched her with wary attention. "There will be good days and setbacks. The goal isn't to get the old Shadow back, that's not realistic after what he's been through. The goal is to help him feel secure again and build new positive associations." Michael nodded, absorbing her guidance with the same focused attention he'd once applied to canine training protocols. Will he ever be able to work again? Dr. Patel considered the question carefully. "It's too early to say. Some dogs do return to modified work after trauma, others don't. But right now, work shouldn't be the focus, just connection and safety." Over the next few weeks, Michael devoted himself entirely to Shadow's recovery, establishing gentle routines that provided structure without pressure. Mornings began with quiet walks in the large fenced backyard, allowing Shadow to explore at his own pace without the stress of encountering strangers. Mealtimes became opportunities for positive reinforcement as Shadow gradually began to eat more reliably. Evenings were spent with Michael reading aloud, a technique borrowed from Sarah that seemed to help Shadow relax. Detective Ramirez visited regularly with updates on the investigation. The second man from the security footage had been identified as Jason Mercer, a former veterinary assistant with ties to a local drug distribution network. When arrested, Mercer had quickly implicated Rick Davis, revealing that the shelter worker had been paid to create false documentation for Shadow and several other dogs that had passed through the shelter over the previous year. "It's bigger than we thought," Ramirez explained during one such visit, keeping her voice low as Shadow dozed lightly in his bed across the room. "We've identified at least 3 other working dogs that disappeared and were processed through various shelters under false identities. 2 were drug detection canines like Shadow, and 1 was a cadaver dog." Michael frowned, processing this information. "So this wasn't just about Shadow specifically. No, it appears to be a targeted effort to remove dogs that posed a threat to their operation. Shadow was taken because he detected something during your training near the ranger station, something they couldn't risk him finding again." The investigation had expanded to include the FBI, given the interstate nature of the drug trafficking operation and the federal offense of stealing police canine. As they built their case, Shadow became an unexpectedly important piece of evidence, not just because of what had been done to him, but because of what he could still do. The breakthrough came 4 weeks after Shadow's return, during a quiet evening at home. Sarah, who had continued to visit regularly after forming her bond with Shadow at the shelter, had brought over some textbooks to study for her veterinary courses. As she settled on the couch and opened her pharmacology textbook, Shadow's demeanor suddenly changed. His head lifted, nose working actively as he focused intently on the book. Then, to both Michael and Sarah's surprise, he rose from his bed and approached, sniffing purposefully at the pages. "Michael," Sarah said quietly, "I think he's alerting." Michael observed Shadow's behavior with growing excitement. The focused attention, the deliberate sniffing pattern, these were the trained behaviors Shadow exhibited when detecting target substances. The textbook must have sample chemical formulae similar to what he was trained to detect, Michael realized. "Sarah, would you mind if we try something?" With Sarah's permission, Michael called Detective Ramirez, who arrived an hour later with a specialized testing kit. Under controlled conditions, they presented Shadow with various scent samples, including compounds similar to those used in manufacturing the synthetic drugs. Shadow's response was definitive. Despite his trauma, his scent detection abilities remained intact. He alerted strongly to the target compounds, demonstrating that the fundamental training that made him valuable as a police canine had survived his ordeal. "This is huge," Ramirez said afterward. "Shadow can still identify the chemical signatures of their manufacturing process. With the right approach, he could help us locate other production sites." Michael was cautious. "I don't want to push him too fast. His recovery has to come first." "Of course," Ramirez agreed, "but even the evidence we have now strengthens our case significantly. The fact that his detection abilities remained intact explains why they targeted him specifically." The discovery energized the investigation. With Shadow's capabilities confirmed, the FBI was able to obtain additional warrants based on the connection between his abduction and the drug operation. Analysis of soil samples from his fur and paws narrowed the search to an area in the northern part of the county, ironically, not far from where he had disappeared during the training exercise. 4 months after Shadow's return, the FBI executed coordinated raids on multiple properties, identified through the investigation. They discovered not only drug manufacturing operations, but also recovered several other missing dogs, including 2 former police canines who, like Shadow, had been stolen because of their abilities to detect certain chemicals. The raids also uncovered documentation implicating a network of corrupt officials who had been protecting the operation, including, most shockingly, Douglas Barnes, the county commissioner who oversaw animal control funding. Further investigation revealed that Barnes had systematically reduced the shelter's budget over the past 3 years, creating the understaffed and overwhelmed conditions that allowed Rick Davis to operate without proper oversight. "It was the perfect setup," Ramirez explained to Michael as they reviewed the evidence. "Barnes cuts funding to create chaos at the shelter, then their operative Rick ensures that any dogs that might expose their operation simply disappear into the system or are processed out where they'll never be found." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "And if the dogs hadn't been valuable canines with handlers looking for them, no one would have ever known." Ramirez finished grimly. "Just more strays that never found homes." The case expanded far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. The drug manufacturing operation was merely one tentacle of a larger criminal enterprise that had infiltrated multiple county departments. Beyond Barnes, 3 other county officials were implicated, along with a veterinarian who had performed the microchip removals and several shelter workers from facilities across the state. As the legal proceedings began, Shadow's recovery continued. 6 months after his return home, he was a different dog than the traumatized shell who had cowered in the shelter. While still cautious around strangers and easily startled by sudden movements, he had regained much of his physical health. The dull coat had regained its luster, and proper nutrition had restored his muscular build. More importantly, the spark of intelligence and purpose in his eyes had returned. He still followed Michael like a shadow, a trait that had earned him his name as a puppy, but it was no longer from fear, it was from the reforged bond between handler and dog. "He's made remarkable progress," Dr. Patel observed during one of her visits. "But I'm still concerned about returning him to full police duty. The stress levels in traditional canine work could trigger regression." Michael nodded, having already come to the same conclusion. I've been thinking about that. I don't think traditional canine work is the right fit for him anymore. He shared his emerging idea with Dr. Patel, a specialized role for Shadow as a rehabilitation partner for other traumatized animals, particularly those recovered from abuse situations. Shadow's unique experience and gentle demeanor with other animals suggested he might have a gift for connecting with fellow survivors in ways humans couldn't. With support from his police department and grant funding secured through Sarah's advocacy, Michael began developing a pioneering program. Shadow would serve as a canine ambassador, helping other traumatized animals navigate their own recovery journeys. Chapter 5. From Darkness to Light. 1 year after the security camera had captured Rick striking Shadow, the Pinecrest County Animal Welfare Center opened its doors. Built with a combination of government funding and private donations, it replaced the outdated and chronically underfunded shelter where Shadow had once cowered in a kennel corner. The center was designed with traumatized animals in mind, quiet spaces with natural light, sound-dampening materials, and thoughtfully designed kennels that provided security without feeling confining. Most innovative was the Shadow program, a pioneering approach to rehabilitation using recovered working dogs to assist in the recovery of other animals. Sarah, now completing her veterinary studies while serving as the center's assistant director, stood beside Michael in the large training yard, watching Shadow work with a recently rescued pit bull. The dog had been recovered from the same fighting ring exposed by their investigation, and like many such animals, it exhibited extreme fear responses that made medical treatment and basic care challenging. Shadow approached with the careful body language he had developed for these interactions. Head slightly lowered, movements slow and deliberate, maintaining a respectful distance while communicating peaceful intentions. The pit bull, which had growled and retreated from all human approaches, watched Shadow with cautious interest. "It's remarkable to watch," Sarah said softly. "He somehow communicates, 'I've been where you are,' in a way they understand." Michael nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "He creates a bridge. Once they trust him, the trust starts to extend to the humans he trusts." By session's end, the pit bull had moved slightly closer to the front of its enclosure, and for the first time since rescue, accepted food in the presence of observers. It was Shadow's fourth success that week. The prosecution team is calling Shadow's work transformative in building their animal cruelty cases, Sarah noted as they walked back to the main building. The before and after documentation is helping judges understand the psychological impact of abuse in ways written reports never could. The program was expanding beyond initial expectations. What had begun as rehabilitation for Shadow had evolved into a pioneering approach to animal welfare in legal contexts. Other departments were sending representatives to learn the techniques, with plans to implement similar programs using recovered working dogs, who might not return to traditional police work. "There's something else," Michael said as they reached the center's entrance. The department's community outreach division wants Shadow to become the face of a new education program about animal welfare and reporting suspected abuse. They believe his story helps people connect emotionally with the issue. Sarah smiled. "From victim to advocate. It's perfect." What neither of them discussed, though both understood, was how Shadow's journey had transformed their own lives as well. Michael had discovered a new purpose beyond traditional police work, becoming a sought-after expert in animal welfare as it intersected with law enforcement. Sarah had found her veterinary career path, focusing on forensic medicine and trauma recovery, with multiple job offers already extended for after her graduation. Their personal relationship had evolved too, growing from a shared connection to Shadow into something deeper. The hours spent working together, celebrating small victories in Shadow's recovery, and building the foundation for the new center had created a bond neither had anticipated but both now treasured. As they entered the building, they passed the framed security camera image that hung in the lobby, the photograph of Shadow cowering as Rick raised his hand. Beside it was a current photo of Shadow working confidently with a traumatized puppy. The simple caption read, "Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest strength." The courtroom fell silent as Shadow entered with Michael. Despite months of preparation, there had been concern about how the German Shepherd would respond to the formal environment and the presence of individuals associated with his trauma. But Shadow walked confidently beside his handler, his rehabilitation complete in ways that once seemed impossible. This hearing represented the culmination of a sprawling investigation that had uncovered corruption extending from local animal control to state-level regulatory agencies. Rick Davis, the caretaker whose abuse had been captured on security footage, was merely one node in a network that had exploited shelter systems to conceal criminal activities, ranging from drug manufacturing to organized theft of specialized working dogs. Shadow's presence today served multiple purposes beyond his symbolic importance to the case. He was demonstrating the pioneering court support dog protocol that Michael and Sarah had developed with legal and behavioral experts. This approach was being considered for implementation in animal welfare cases nationwide, allowing recovered animals to be present during proceedings without causing undue stress to the animals or disruption to court functions. As Shadow settled on his designated mat near the witness stand, the judge addressed the assembly. "I want to acknowledge the unusual nature of today's proceedings. The presence of this particular service animal has been approved due to his unique connection to this case and the precedent it may establish for future animal welfare prosecutions." Sarah, seated in the gallery, felt a swell of pride as Shadow maintained his composed demeanor. She thought back to their first meeting in that shelter supply closet, the terrified dog hiding behind blankets, too traumatized to make eye contact. His transformation was more than a personal victory. It represented the potential for healing that existed in even the most damaged victims. The prosecution presented evidence methodically, including the security footage that had started the investigation. When the video of Rick striking Shadow played on the courtroom monitors, the German Shepherd's ears flicked toward the sound, but he remained calm, grounded by Michael's reassuring presence and the extensive desensitization training they had undertaken. Expert witnesses explained how the investigation had expanded from that single incident to uncover an operation that had used shelters as processing points for stolen animals, particularly those with specialized training that made them valuable or threatening to criminal enterprises. When Michael took the stand, Shadow maintained his position nearby, a living testament to both the trauma inflicted and the healing possible through proper intervention. Michael detailed Shadow's original training, disappearance, and the remarkable reunion at the shelter, his testimony punctuated by occasional glances at his partner. "In your professional opinion," the prosecutor asked, "what would have happened to Shadow had the abuse not been captured on security footage?" Michael considered the question carefully. Based on the pattern established by the investigation, Shadow would likely have been processed through the shelter system under his false identity as Maverick, then transferred to another facility, or adopted out through channels controlled by the network. His valuable training would have been exploited, or if deemed too risky due to his ability to detect their drug manufacturing, he might have been eliminated. The implications hung heavily in the courtroom. How many other animals had been processed through similar channels before the scheme was uncovered? How many working dogs had disappeared without the determination that had driven Shadow's case forward? Chapter 6, Full Circle. 2 years to the day after Shadow's rescue from Pinecrest County Animal Shelter, a ribbon-cutting ceremony marked the opening of the expanded Shadow's Second Chance Center for Animal Rehabilitation and Training. The facility, built on repurposed county land, with a combination of government funding and private donations, represented the tangible outcome of the case that had transformed animal welfare practices across the state. Shadow, now 8 years old and fully recovered from his ordeal, sat attentively beside Michael as officials made their remarks. His graying muzzle and the small patches of white fur around his eyes gave him a distinguished appearance, complementing the specialized therapy dog vest he wore in his role as the center's canine ambassador. Sarah, who had completed her veterinary degree and now served as the center's medical director, watched from nearby, remembering the frightened dog she had found hiding in a supply closet. The contrast between that traumatized animal and the confident, balanced German Shepherd before her never ceased to amaze her. The center had multiple functions. It served as a rehabilitation facility for animals recovered from abuse situations, a training center for law enforcement and animal control officers, and an educational resource for the community. Most innovatively, it housed the working dog recovery program that Shadow had inspired, a specialized approach to rehabilitating service and working dogs who had experienced trauma or required retraining for new roles. After the ceremony, visitors toured the facility, learning about the programs that had grown from Shadow's case. In the rehabilitation wing, rescued animals received specialized care designed to address both physical and psychological trauma. The training center provided certification courses for animal welfare professionals, emphasizing evidence-based approaches to investigating abuse and supporting recovery. At the heart of it all was the bond between handler and animal, exemplified by Michael and Shadow. Their partnership had evolved from traditional police work to pioneering new territory in animal-assisted rehabilitation. Together they had worked with dozens of traumatized animals, helping them reconnect with humans, and when possible, return to service in modified roles suited to their experiences. As the day's formal activities concluded, Michael, Sarah, and Shadow found a quiet moment away from the crowds, watching a recently rescued border collie explore one of the rehabilitation yards under the gentle guidance of another therapy dog. "Remember when we thought success would be just getting him back on police duty?" Michael said, smiling as Shadow observed the other dogs with calm attention. Sarah nodded, her hand finding Michael's. The simple gold band on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight, a recent addition that had made official what everyone at the center had seen growing between them over the past 2 years. "He found a different purpose," she replied. "Maybe the one he was always meant for." The investigation sparked by Shadow's case had led to significant convictions, with Rick Davis, Commissioner Barnes, and several higher-level operators receiving substantial sentences. More importantly, it had exposed systemic vulnerabilities that had allowed the exploitation of shelters and working animals. The resulting reforms included enhanced security protocols, better training for shelter staff, and specialized tracking systems for working dogs. Shadow would never know the full impact of his story, how a moment of cruelty captured on camera had unleashed a chain of events that transformed an entire system. But as he guided another traumatized animal toward recovery, his actions spoke to a truth that had emerged from his journey. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the greatest capacity for healing others. The German Shepherd, who had once cowered after a harsh blow, now stood as a living embodiment of resilience, his very presence communicating to damaged animals and the humans who cared for them that trauma need not define a life, that fear could be overcome, and that purpose could be found even after profound betrayal. As the day ended and visitors departed, Shadow returned to the home he shared with Michael and Sarah, where he would rest before returning to his work tomorrow. The security cameras that had once captured his moment of victimization now served a different purpose, documenting success stories and training techniques that would help countless other animals. From a single act of cruelty had grown a legacy of compassion that would continue long after Shadow's working days were done, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are those who have themselves experienced the very conditions they help transform. Epilogue. The ripple effect 5 years after the opening of the expanded center, Shadow's gray muzzle had whitened completely, and his pace had slowed. At 13, he had gradually stepped back from active rehabilitation work, though he still made regular appearances at the center, his calm presence a living testament to the program's founding principles. On a crisp autumn morning, Michael and Sarah brought him to the center for a special occasion, the graduation ceremony for the 10th class of canine rehabilitation specialists trained in the methods Shadow had helped pioneer. The program had expanded nationally, with similar centers established in 15 states and growing international interest. As Michael helped Shadow from the car, he moved with the careful consideration of someone assisting an elderly friend. Shadow's hips had stiffened with age, but his eyes remained clear and intelligent, taking in the familiar surroundings with evident satisfaction. The ceremony took place in the center's main training yard, where rows of chairs had been arranged facing a small podium. Shadow settled on his cushioned mat beside Michael and Sarah, acknowledging the respectful greetings of staff members with dignified nods of his gray head. Among the graduating class was a young Belgian Malinois named Beacon, who had been recovered from a fighting ring preparation facility where he'd been kept as a bait dog to train fighting dogs without fighting back. His physical scars had healed, but the psychological damage had been profound. Through the Shadow program, he had gradually transformed from a terrified shutdown animal to a confident therapy dog, specializing in working with children who had experienced trauma. After the certificates were presented, the center's director invited Michael to the podium. Shadow rose without prompting and accompanied him, moving slowly but purposefully to stand beside his longtime partner. When we started this program 5 years ago, Michael began, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's head. Many people thought we were being overly optimistic. The idea that traumatized animals could not only recover but become healers themselves seemed far-fetched to traditional thinking. He gestured toward the graduating class and their canine partners. Today there are over 200 certified teams working across the country. Together, they've helped thousands of animals and, by extension, the humans who love them. All because one security camera captured a moment that could have been lost to indifference. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, a young woman approached Michael, Sarah, and Shadow. She knelt respectfully before addressing Shadow directly. "You don't remember me," she said softly, "but I was there the day they brought my father in, Commissioner Barnes. I was in the courtroom when you helped make the case that sent him to prison." Michael tensed slightly, uncertain of her intentions, but Shadow regarded the woman with calm attention. "I wanted you to know," she continued, "that watching you that day, seeing how you had recovered from what was done to you, it changed me. I'd spent years making excuses for my father's behavior, but seeing the consequences through you." She paused, collecting herself. "I went into veterinary forensics because of you. I specialize in detecting and documenting animal abuse for criminal cases now." She looked up at Michael and Sarah. "The ripple effects of what you all started here, they go further than you know." As she rose to leave, she placed something on the ground in front of Shadow, a small framed photograph. It showed a rescue dog with a missing eye and partially healed scars, sitting alertly beside her in what appeared to be a courtroom setting. "That's my partner, Justice. He was rescued in a raid that happened because of policy changes implemented after your case. He helps me investigate abuse cases now, one recovery inspiring another, and another after that." That evening, as Michael helped Shadow settle onto his memory foam bed by the fireplace, he reflected on the young woman's words. "The ripple effects go further than you know." It was true, they could never fully comprehend how many lives, human and animal, had been touched by the chain of events that began with a moment of cruelty captured on camera. Sarah joined them, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Shadow's bed. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked, noticing Michael's contemplative expression. "I was just thinking about how close we came to missing all of this," he replied. "If that security camera hadn't been working that day, if you hadn't found him in that closet, if Ramirez hadn't made the connection to my missing partner." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of those pivotal moments. Sometimes the worst things lead to the most important changes, not because the suffering itself has value, but because it creates witnesses who refuse to look away. Shadow sighed contentedly as she gently massaged his ears, his eyes half closing in pleasure. In his long and extraordinary life, he had been many things: a police canine at the height of his abilities, a traumatized victim hiding behind shelter blankets, a pioneer in animal rehabilitation, and now, in his twilight years, a living legend whose story had transformed approaches to animal welfare across the country. What he understood, in his canine way, was simpler but no less profound: that fear could give way to courage, that broken bonds could be reformed stronger than before, and that purpose could emerge from the darkest moments if one remained open to the possibility of healing. As Shadow drifted to sleep beside the humans who had helped him transform victimhood into legacy, the security cameras at the center continued their silent vigilance, no longer just witnesses to cruelty, but chroniclers of recovery, resilience, and the extraordinary capacity for renewal that exists in all living beings when given the chance to heal. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the Canine Code Red channel. Your support helps bring more of these powerful narratives to light and raises awareness about animal welfare issues that too often remain in the shadows. Leave a comment about what Shadow's journey meant to you. How did his transformation from victim to healer resonate with your own experiences or understanding of trauma and recovery? Remember that every act of compassion creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see, and every voice raised against cruelty helps build a world where stories like Shadow's become increasingly rare.